I'm on a mission like a couple spies, and that, guys, is the reason why I catechize.
Welcome to the Reformed Standard. I'm Tony. Let's get started. Question 14 of the Westminster Larger Catechism is, how doth God execute his decrees? The answer is, God executeth his decrees in the works of creation and providence, according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will. So this is one of those questions that kind of sets up the next few questions. So we might have a little bit of a shorter episode today. But there's a few main points for us to keep in mind here. What we'll see is that God executes his decrees in two ways. There's the work of creation, in which God creates all things out of nothing, merely by the power of his word. And there's the work of providence, in which God sustains and upholds all things according to his power, also according to the power of his word. And so the question here indicates that these works unfold, or these works happen according to God's infallible foreknowledge. Now, we shouldn't think about this, we shouldn't read this as sort of the Arminian Pelagian idea that God looks forward in time and acts in response to what he sees. The theology of William Lane Craig and other Molinists, although Craig is a little bit unique in the world of Molinism, but Molinism is at its core an apprehended knowledge that God has certain knowledge that comes from his nature. And then he has other knowledge that comes from his knowledge of what is possible. And then there's knowledge which comes from the knowledge of what free creatures would or will do. And in Molinism, the modification of that is that it's in any given circumstance, God knows what a free creature would do. Where that differs from Orthodox Calvinism is that in Calvinism, that knowledge is determined by God because that knowledge is a result of God's decree. So God knows what agent A would do in circumstance B because he designs and creates agent A in a certain way. On Arminianism or Molinism, God knows what agent A would do in circumstance B, not because he created agent A a particular way, but because he knows what agent A would do as a result of his freely determined, uncoerced will. So this infallible foreknowledge really sets up a different doctrine of God than we see in Arminianism or in Molinism, and then of course open theism, which I think is just the natural consequence of those two systems. When you have a God, or when you postulate a deity that receives knowledge from an external source, the only logical conclusion of that position is that God, not determining the future, isn't himself determined by the future. And so this kind of flows out into the next clause here, where it says that not only does he determine and act and execute his decrees according to his infallible foreknowledge, but according to the free and immutable counsel of his own will. So there's nothing outside of God that determines what he will decree, and there's nothing outside of God's own being and God's own will which determines how he would execute those decrees. And so God knows what will happen and foreordains what will happen because he knows himself and he knows his own will. And so this is kind of technical theology. This is kind of Reformed scholastic theology, sort of at its height. But I think it's important for us to tie this to the scriptural testimony. So I'm going to read one of the proof texts that the divines here use in the support of this, and it's Acts 4:24-28, and it comes from Peter's sermon at Pentecost. And what he says here, what the text says here, is this: and when they heard that, they being the Jewish listeners of Peter's sermon, They lifted up their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, thou art God which made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, who by the mouth of the servant David hath said, why did the heathen rage, and why did the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth against the holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together, for to do whatsoever they had, whatever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. So what this is saying is that God doesn't look to the fact that Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Romans and the people of Israel, mainly the Jewish leaders in Israel, he didn't look to what they were going to do. He didn't look to the evil in their hearts and say, I'm going to utilize this evil in order to bring about my plan of redemption. Instead, and this is a difficult word for us to think about, this is a difficult teaching for us to think about, but instead it's precisely the opposite. That God had foreordained according to the counsel of his own immutable will to bring about the crucifixion of his only Son. And in order to bring that about, he gathered together Herod, Pontius Pilate, the Gentiles, and the people of Israel. And he ordained the evil in their hearts that would lead to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And so it's important for us to always remember that the way that God executes his decrees is not a response to human freedom. It's not a response to the natural outworkings of creaturely freedom. But it happens because God is good and sovereign and just, and he takes action in order to glorify himself and to bring about the good of his people.
Do you know, if you want, you could know this? The Catechism, hey, the Catechism, hey. Do you know what the chief and the man is? And how the Father, Son, and Spirit do manage? Do you know, if you want, you could know?
West Side.